Thank you, Fred, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us. For a number of years, the topic of climate change, or I should use a new term to be shortly coined, climate breakdown, has been with us. Usually, the discussion centers on storms, fires, droughts, floods, and other major events. Not often discussed, but always present is the effect of climate change/breakdown on the plant and animal worlds and the many delicately balanced ecological systems which we humans share with all the living creatures on this planet. Our guest speaker today, Mr. Adam Welts, has written a recently published book titled The End of Eden: Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown, which addresses this topic in a very readable manner. The book has been well received with an excellent review by the New York Times Book Review section, a copy of which is over here to my right, along with copies of the book, which will be for sale. It has also received a recommendation from the New Yorker magazine. Mr. Welts, a resident of Cape Town, South Africa, is an enthusiastic naturalist and widely traveled environmental writer. His work has appeared in The Guardian, Yale Environment 360, The Atlantic, and other outlets worldwide. He is a recipient of the Middlebury Fellowship in Environmental Journalism. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, I have to add, Adam is married to my daughter, Sarah. And he's the father of the most gorgeous 3 triplets that walk this earth. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Adam Welts.
Well, thank you all very much for coming here today. I see a nice turnout, which is always good to see. As Dick said, I'm his son-in-law, and I'm very glad to be here. We were originally going to do this completely via Zoom, but thanks to some fortuitous coincidences, I'm actually able to be here in person, and that's a really good thing. So getting on to the presentation. You know, we've all heard about climate change, or as I prefer to call it, climate breakdown. And we've seen a lot of stuff in the media. Obviously, you've read things about, you know, the big fires in Canada recently, fires in California, hurricanes in the Caribbean hitting Florida, and so on. But one thing that's notable about nearly all the media coverage and most of the books and documentary films that get made about climate change is that they focus on one species, and that is Homo sapiens, us. You know, the question is always asked, what does it mean for us? What's it going to do to us? What is it doing to us? And I figured, well, you know, we share the planet with millions of other species. Perhaps it's time to spend, put a little more focus on them. And so I wrote this book over the last few years. I've been working on it. It came out around a month ago here. And the book is really, it's not really very much focused on us at all. It's about the species out there. And the aim of the book is, the way it's pitched is it's aimed at folks who've never done a formal ecology course in their lives. You don't have to be an expert on this stuff. You don't have to know anything about it, really. You just have to be, you know, a smart person who reads books, and you'll understand. That's the whole point of this thing. Although if you are one of those people who's looked at nature their whole lives and been interested in ecology, I think you'll also find some stories in here that you didn't know. So there's something for everybody. It was deliberately designed that way. And I think the best way to lead out this talk is to read a few pages from the introduction of the book, which I deliberately open the book in a New York city park. Now, I used to live in New York for a few years. I got to know the city quite well. I'm a very keen bird watcher. I bird watched a lot in the city parks, particularly Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And so what I wanted to do by opening the book in New York City is say to people, look, you might have heard about the Arctic melting and stuff about polar bears freezing, and, you know, if you know something about, you know, the effects of climate change on nature. But actually, climate change is affecting all species everywhere. It's affecting the species in your backyard. It's happening, it's changing ecosystems all around you. So I wanted to take the focus off these faraway places that a lot of people, will never see, and bring it into New York. And how I open the chapter is I how I open the introduction is asking people to imagine themselves walking through the city, walking through a park that, aside from the fact that maybe everybody's attached to a tiny little computer known as a cell phone, maybe hasn't seemed to have changed very much in the last 30, 40 years. But what I tell folks is actually it has changed a lot. Bird numbers are declining rather sharply. Insect numbers are declining rather sharply. Bat numbers have gone through the floor. A lot of plants that were in that park 30, 40 years ago are not there anymore because new diseases have arrived that have wiped them out. We've had hurricanes like in New York, Sandy and Irene, that knocked down tons of old trees and wiped them out of the system. And so even if you walk through the park now and sort of think to yourself, well, it looks kind of the same, ecologically speaking, it's a transformed place, and it's still changing, and it's changing ever more rapidly and ever more unpredictably. And so I'll lead in a little further. I'll start reading a little further into the introduction, just to give you a sense of. I'll read the section that really explains what the book is about. So I start off. If Earth was the size of an apple, the atmosphere would be about as thick as the apple's skin. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in about 1760, humans have been performing an uncontrolled experiment on this fragile, life-giving cocoon. We've decided to burn incomprehensibly many gigatons of fossil fuels and spew their combusted remains into the air, while simultaneously destroying millions of acres of forests, savannas, and prairies for industrial agriculture and ever-sprawling roads and cities, thus releasing even greater volumes of energy-trapping gases into the atmosphere. This is wreaking havoc on nature from the largest to the smallest scales. Extreme weather events are intensifying, like mega droughts that are afflicting vast areas for years and mega fires that are burning up millions of acres with breathtaking speed. But species and ecosystems are also being eroded and rearranged more subtly as local microclimates shift and change, forcing smaller, less noticed life forms to evolve, move away, or wither into extinction. These intimate ecological breakups and breakdowns are of no less consequence than the so-called natural disasters that generate dramatic headlines, and they're happening all around us. We're creating an all-penetrating phenomenon that is scrambling ecosystems and triggering cascades of chaos throughout the biosphere. It's something like a monster from ancient Greek mythology that, as it embraces the world, sprouts thickets of writhing necks from which horrifying sharp-toothed heads emerge. Looking into its faces can turn humans to stone. This is not the first time a miasma of this kind has enveloped our planet. Energy-trapping gas concentrations and global temperatures have spiked before during the 4 billion years of life on Earth. Natural events like colossal, long-lasting volcanic eruptions and massive meteorite impacts have, on a few rare occasions, triggered huge climate shifts and devastating mass extinctions that are laid down hard in the fossil record. But the current rise is different. Not only is it caused by humans, but data indicate that greenhouse gas concentrations are going up far faster than in any previous epoch. We've pushed atmospheric carbon dioxide from its natural pre-industrial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million in just 10 human generations, and we're increasing it further still. There is now more CO2 in the air than there has been for at least 3 million years. Since our own species evolved into its current form only about 200,000 years ago, this means we're creating an atmosphere profoundly unlike any we and huge numbers of other species have lived in before. We are making and breathing changed air. It's also noteworthy that life achieved its peak of diversity about 200,000 years ago. Never did more different species live together on Earth than at the dawn of the human era. Our species emerged in an Eden, not the sanitized, fantastical Eden of religious books, but the most wondrous fabric of living things that our planet has ever been clothed in. Climate change is not my favorite term for the phenomenon at the center of this book, although I sometimes use it. For one thing, it's contradictory. Climate, as we learn about it in school, is constant and predictable, the antithesis of change. Placing these opposites together makes the term subconsciously feel meaningless or perfidious to many people. Change also implies reversibility, that if the climate is changing, it can easily return to its previous state. This is misleading because many of the shifts and transformations that we have already observed are effectively irreversible and will become increasingly entrenched the longer harmful emissions continue. I think a term like climate breakdown better communicates the current situation. Breakdown acknowledges that climate is a type of definable pattern or structure that is breaking apart and not easily reassembled. Its cause, human activity, is well understood, and the word is serious and directional. It doesn't refer to a random temporary variation in the weather. Global weirding is another good one, as it conveys the novelty and strangeness of the climate crisis. Climate breakdown seldom operates alone. It isn't the only force driving ecosystem collapses and species extinctions. Most of the damage we're seeing is caused by acting synergistically with other harmful outcomes of human activity, including pollution, habitat destruction, and invasive species. Climate breakdown can inflict further harm on ecosystems already damaged by other forces. It can amplify other forces' impacts on the natural world. And I'll skip a section now and read a few more paragraphs. Science meanders toward greater truth in fits and starts, sometimes losing its way for a while. Many of its revelations are provisional, waiting to be superseded by newer, deeper, more rigorous research. It's nonetheless a powerful and vitally important tool for understanding the era we're entering. Although no one has a complete idea of how climate breakdown will transform the living communities of the biosphere in 10, 50, 100, or 1,000 years from now, because it's impossible to make detailed predictions about such complex interactive systems, scientists and other careful observers are starting to understand some of the new ripples and breaks that are running through wild species and ecosystems. It's challenging work, but by striving to understand the reasons for the changes we are already seeing, they're beginning to be able to make useful predictions about the likely future nature of nature on this heating planet. This book is the result of my efforts to look into the terrifying faces of the new climate behemoth without turning myself to stone. I've chosen to tell the stories of a few species in a few places to illuminate some of the important ways that our gas emissions are fracturing and reshaping the entire natural world. Readers should assume that if a climate-related force is affecting one species in a particular place, it's probably having similar effects on other species elsewhere. The facts, scenes, and expositions within these pages flow from personal experience, experts' observations, and scientific research, although readers require no specialist knowledge. This book is written for everyone. I hope it brings you closer to the wild creatures of our tarnished Eden as they try to survive this extraordinary, uncertain period in our shared history, and inspires you to act with intelligence and courage for their persistence, their continued thriving with us. So that basically sets the scene. You understand what the book is about. And what I'll do now is I'll go through a few of the stories I tell through in the book. It was quite difficult to figure out which resolution to use when writing this book, because on the one hand, everything's changing, right? Everything everywhere is changing due to climate change. You might not have noticed it yet, but it is. But to tell folks, well, everything's changing and here are all these big, enormous things that are going on is kind of useless because it's too big. People don't know how to grasp onto that, and they don't really know what to do with that information, right? What do I do with it? But yet telling stories that are too small and too isolated, which often happens in the media, is also kind of useless. Sometimes I'll read in a newspaper, oh, scientists have discovered that a certain butterfly species in California is being affected by climate change. It's moving north or something like this. Well, what do I do about this little butterfly that's in California if I live in Illinois? Or, how do I do anything? So it was quite tough to figure out how to tell the story. And what I settled on doing is making each chapter a kind of a theme. So each chapter addresses a particular way in that climate change affects wild species. And I use examples. I tell the story of certain species in certain places within each chapter. And again, as I've already done in the introduction, I invite readers to assume that, look, if this thing is happening to this species in this place for this reason, it's happening to other species elsewhere. So I want to give folks the tools to understand what's going on through these rather intimate stories. And I'm not really interested in people in this book. I don't tell the story through the eyes of scientists, which a lot of people, would tell a story like this through, oh, scientist Dr. So-and-so is putting on her boots and marching into the jungle. And, they'd tell a story through the eyes of humans. I try and foreground the species as the characters in the story. I tried not to mention the name of any living scientists. I mentioned a few dead scientists' names, but I don't want this to be about human characters at all. And hopefully this PowerPoint works. I'm going to start because I'm interested in birds. A lot of the species in this book are actually not birds. I tell the story of trees and bugs and things like that, and even some mammals. But I realized after I put this talk together that pretty much all of the main characters in this talk are birds. But that's how things happen. This bird that you see on the screen now is a very, very charismatic Southern African species. It's a medium-sized bird called the Southern Yellow-billed Hornbill. They're about this size. They're super smart and they're super characterful and they're a heck of a lot of fun to watch. And they're quite common in the savanna ecosystems of central Southern Africa. However, and one of the places where they're particularly common and particularly well known is a region we call the Kalahari or the Kalahari, depending on which language you use to describe this. This is an area that's underlain by red sand dunes, a sort of a very reddish kind of sand, and it's very dry. It's a grassland that has some very nice old gnarly African thorn trees that mostly grow along the dry river courses that run through this area. It's a beautiful area, and these are some of the most, this species is one of the most obvious birds you'll see around there. It's really a characteristic bird of the region. But as I say in the book, this bird is on its way out in the Kalahari. It's disappearing rapidly from the Kalahari. And the reason is quite hard to figure out. And luckily, again, we have some very observant scientists from the University of Cape Town and other places who've been following these birds for a long time. And they've managed to figure out why they're disappearing. And to understand why, you have to know a little bit about this bird's breeding system. They have a very odd breeding system in the sense that they find a nice old hole in one of these old thorn trees that are scattered through the savanna, a nice old cavity, where a branch has come out. And a pair of birds gets together and they then imprison the female in this hole by the male and the female getting together and building a wall out of their feces. They put their feces into kind of a wall over the front of this hole, and it dries really hard, kind of like a thin layer of concrete. And they leave a little slit inside in the middle of this wall that they've built. And the female, who's now inside this very dark hole, she lays her eggs, and she also undergoes a full feather molt. She loses all her main feathers and regrows new ones. And it's quite convenient then to have this wall because that protects her from predators, for the time period that she can't fly. But this means that the male who's on the outside has to do twice as much work as he normally has to do because he has to find food for her and for him. So he runs around catching little lizards and bugs and small rodents and things like this and rushing around and bringing them to her in the nest. And after some time, when the eggs hatch, they break open this wall, she leaves the nest, then they build the wall back up again with the little nestlings inside, and then both of them have to run around finding all this extra food for their growing nestlings. Well, about 10 years ago, when various research projects, were looking at these birds in the Kalahari, they were doing just fine. Their breeding success was good. They were, managing to produce a lot of very healthy young. In recent years, their breeding success has absolutely dropped off a cliff. It's, in any given year now, it's maybe 5% of the babies that fledge as did 10 years ago or so. And it's not because these birds are falling out of the sky or having any obvious diseases or having anything obvious wrong with them. What's happening to them is they're running out of time. Their schedules are being messed up by global warming. And how this works is that at the peak of a nice hot day, and they tend to breed in the warm season, sometimes the temperatures in the Kalahari go so high that these birds would go into hypothermia, they would die if they didn't immediately get into the shade and do nothing and start panting. Because birds don't have sweat glands. They have to offload thermal energy, heat, by evaporating water off the inside of their mouths, and they pant. Obviously, they have to get out of the sun if they don't want to get more heat to avoid the radiant heat from the sun, the direct light. And they have to do nothing because the more they move around, the more thermal energy they generate from the activity of their muscles inside. And about 10, 20 years ago, in the peak of the hottest days in the Kalahari, these birds might have to pant and do nothing in the shade for half an hour at the peak of the hottest part of the day. And nowadays, temperatures have risen just a little bit in the Kalahari, but this little rise means that they have to spend sometimes 3 or 4 hours a day sitting in the shade and doing nothing. And this means that they simply don't have enough time left, enough hours in the day to find enough food to give their babies. So their babies tend to starve in the nest, or even if they do fledge, come out of the nest, they're in very, very poor condition, and most of them die very soon afterwards. And so at the rate that temperature rise is going in the Kalahari, we are likely to see total breeding failure from the year 2027 onwards, and that's not very far away. And so these birds will vanish. You know, the adult birds live for maybe 15 years. There will still be some adult birds in this region for a while, you know, until they all die out. But these birds are set to vanish from the heart of the area that they occupy. And it's not only in the Kalahari we're seeing this, and it's not only with hornbills we're seeing this. Loads of other birds in the Kalahari are also disappearing from the center of the area. But the Mojave Desert in Southern California, for example, has lost half of its breeding birds over the last 100 years for very much the same reasons. They haven't dramatically fallen out of the sky. It's not a big, you know, sudden event that's wiped all these birds out. It's just this gradual failure in breeding that results from daytime heat getting too high and messing up these birds' schedules, forcing them to spend more and more time doing nothing in the shade, essentially, just to survive. So a lot of what climate breakdown does to wild species and wild systems is quite subtle in the way that it plays out, but its effects are nonetheless rather dramatic. Here's another bird. This is a story I tell in the book in quite some detail. I'll tell a very short version of it here. This is a bird called a Puerto Rican parrot. This is a photograph that I took in a captive breeding facility that I visited in 2019. This bird, for various reasons, mostly related to human deforestation, was almost extinct in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It's a large, beautiful parrot, as you can see, that's only found on Puerto Rico, nowhere else on Earth. And in the early 1970s, there were certainly less than 20 of these birds left alive in a tiny little flock in a very small patch of old forest in Puerto Rico. And it was one of the first birds that was listed under the US Endangered Species Act. So from the early 1970s onwards, a lot of time and money and energy and expertise has been put into turning this bird around, pulling this bird back from extinction. And today there are probably about 400 of these birds in existence. But there's a little catch. It's not only a good news story. Because back in the 1970s, when conservationists decided that, you know, they were going to put some serious effort into saving this bird from extinction, the first thing they did was there were few wild nests. They also nest in old holes in trees, just like the hornbills do. What they did is they sent climbers up, and as soon as the birds had laid a little clutch of eggs, they stole the eggs from the birds. And they took those eggs and raised them in captivity. They put them in incubators and they raised the babies in cages with a lot of tender, loving care. And this is a very standard technique to use for very rare birds, because what it does is it effectively can double your baby output, because you can steal, when you steal the first load of eggs that the birds have laid, it often induces them to lay a second clutch to replace that. So you steal the first lot and you raise those in captivity, and then you leave the second lot with the birds to raise, those babies, and you can double the numbers then, quite quickly. There was a little problem though, because these birds were so rare. There were no Puerto Rican parrots in captivity that they could use as foster parents for the ones that they took out of the wild. But they did have a closely related species called a Hispaniolan parrot that looks pretty similar to this, very close relative. And they had some Hispaniolan parrots that had been taken from illegal bird dealers and people who'd been keeping them in cages as pets illegally. And so they gave these little Puerto Rican parrots to these Hispaniolan parrot foster parents in the captive breeding facilities. And again, that went fine in the sense that the Hispaniolan parrots looked after the baby Puerto Rican parrots. They fed them enough and so on. But parrots have language. Every different species of parrot has its own culture, which is expressed through unique vocalizations that carry a lot of meaning. And what happened was that these Puerto Rican parrots that were being raised in captivity were learning the Hispaniolan parrot language from their foster parents, and not very good Hispaniolan parrot either, because a lot of those Hispaniolan parrots hadn't even been wild birds. They'd themselves been raised in captivity and kept in cages. So they learned a very simplified kind of Hispaniolan, what I call the language of the cages. And what happened was, once these birds were big and healthy and they'd been trained to eat the right foods and so on, they were then released into the Puerto Rican parrot flocks out there to bolster the numbers out in the wild. But they didn't do very well, because Puerto Rican parrots are preyed on very heavily by a bird called a red-tailed hawk. It's a very common bird. You see them around here. You also get a lot of them in Puerto Rico. And when the wild Puerto Rican parrots, the few last wild ones, would sort of scream, help, look out, red-tailed hawk, 5 o'clock high, whatever, the captive bred birds would go, huh, and get killed. So they didn't do terribly well. But nonetheless, conservationists have really tried really hard, and they've produced hundreds and hundreds of these birds in captivity and been releasing. And every now and again, maybe one of the smarter ones learns a little bit enough of Puerto Rican parrot, just to get by and survive. And so you've had a sort of slowly increasing wild free-flying flock of these birds. By 2017, there were about 50 of them flying out there, but only about 25 of those were like real wild birds that had a continuous, ancestry, wild ancestry that spoke proper Puerto Rican parrot language, and that really could get by and, understood all the predators and could tell the other parrots where to find their particular kinds of food and all of this kind of thing, and exhibit the full range of wild behaviors. And the long, sad story is when Hurricane Maria came along in 2017, it killed every single last one of the 25 that spoke the old language. So the Puerto Rican parrot still exists as a species. As I say, I went there in 2019. There's still cages full of them. They've released some of these birds into captivity, and with a lot of assistance, with the fake nests and all sorts of help, some of these birds can even breed kind of in the free-flying wild area. But the old culture of the Puerto Rican parrot is gone. And so the question arises, is this still a Puerto Rican parrot if it doesn't speak Puerto Rican parrot? And what is the effect then of climate change that we're not seeing on a whole lot of other species? When you get these devastating megastorms or these events or these fires or whatever that cause species to lose parts of their culture or parts of their behavior or their role in an ecosystem. So often, again, the impact of these things is more subtle, but it's nonetheless quite real, and it raises a lot of interesting questions. This is a bird called the Afro-Siberian red knot. It's a little shorebird, one of these little gray things you might have seen, poking around in the mud flats on the edge of the lake, on the rivers. You see a lot of different species of shorebirds around here. The red knot as a species is considered by most people to have about 6 subspecies. These are different races that look slightly different and that breed in different places and migrate to different places. All of them breed up high up above the Arctic Circle in the Arctic, and they migrate south for the Arctic winter. And the Afro-Siberian red knot, the one in this photograph here, it's not red and it doesn't look like a knot. So, don't ask me why, but it's called a red knot. I can actually explain it to you, but it's a long and silly sort of bird story. This bird breeds up in northern Siberia, in Russia, on a place called the Taymyr Peninsula, which is a sort of big hammerhead of land that sort of sticks out way up in the Arctic. And like most birds that breed up in these extreme latitudes, their breeding is a really stressful, tightly scheduled affair, right? Because for most of the year, that area is covered in ice. Pretty much nothing lives. There's nothing for these birds to eat. They would die if they were up there at that time. So they have to time their migration. They come all the way more than 5,000 miles from West Africa. They have to time their arrival in the Arctic. They've always done this where they arrive up in that area within 1 or 2 days of the spring snowmelt beginning. So as soon as those tundra areas start melting, then the vegetation starts coming to life again. Then sort of insects and other invertebrates start living and being produced in there. They have some food. So these birds arrive in the Arctic. They take 2-3 days, sometimes 4 days to pair up, the males to find each other and agree that they're going to be together, at least for this season. The female lays usually 4 eggs in a little scrape on the ground. They don't even build a nest. It's just a little thing on the ground. The male and the female incubate the eggs for about 2 weeks. They take turns keeping these eggs warm. As soon as the little babies hatch, they're tiny little fluff balls. They're like smaller than golf balls. They can already feed themselves as soon as they're not helpless. They're what we call precocial chicks. They can run around on their tiny little legs. As soon as these eggs hatch, the female says, "Cheers, mate," and she heads off south and leaves the male to raise the babies. He has to, because they're so small and can still get quite cold, even though by now it's kind of Arctic summer, he has to pick them up every 20 minutes or so and wedges them literally kind of in his armpits under his wings to warm them up. I've seen some ridiculous photos of red knots with little funny legs kind of sticking out of underneath their wings like that. And he warms them up and he raises them. He keeps them safe from predators. He shows them where to find the bugs and so on. And they grow unbelievably fast, from hatching to flying size, about 2.5 weeks in this bird. You can just about see them growing, kind of thing. And they have to hoover up just incredible amounts of protein to grow at this rapid rate. And as soon as they've reached sort of flying size, the male says, "Cheers, fellas, you're on your own." And he heads off south back to Africa. And they stick around for another week or so, trying to pack on as much protein they can. And then they use a genetically programmed sort of migration route to follow more or less in the footsteps of their folks all the way across Europe in various stages to West Africa. Now, this breeding system has worked really well for them there's various studies that indicate they've been doing this for at least 60,000 years in this particular site, and probably in other places, somewhat, in the north for longer. But the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And with the result that the spring snowmelt is arriving earlier and earlier every year. And actually at the moment, it's arriving about a month earlier than it did in the late 1980s. It's come a lot earlier. But these birds are not able to adjust their migration timing enough to arrive a month earlier too. They're arriving about 2 weeks earlier than they did in the early 1980s. So they're arriving, they're doing their normal thing, they're pairing up, they're laying their eggs, they're raising their babies and so on. But by the time that the babies hatch out of the eggs, the insect populations are in decline. In the earlier times, when they laid their eggs within a few days of spring snowmelt beginning, the babies would hatch just as insect populations, especially of a special kind of insect called a crane fly, was reaching its peak in the tundra, and the babies had access to really good high quality protein. Now the peak of insect populations is arriving in relative terms 2 weeks before that time that they hatch. And it's already in decline by the time that the youngsters are out looking for protein. And so they don't get enough protein. So they're malnourished. So they're around 20% or a fifth smaller than they were in the 1980s, the average Afro-Siberian red knot. And that's fine in the sense that they still live and they still manage to run around on the tundra and they can still fly and they still look like red knots. They're just, dwarf red knots, But they fly all the way across the 5,000 miles. They stop in a few places in Europe and they make it all the way to the coast of Mauritania, the western edge of the Sahara Desert in West Africa. There, as they have done for tens of thousands of years, they eat these very small clams that are in the mudflats of this giant coastal wetland. And you can see this bird eating a clam. It's about the size of a dime coin. It's a little protein-rich clam. And the youngsters have, need to eat these clams and lots of them to be healthy because, to get a lot of protein. But what's happening now is because they're dwarf red knots, because they've been malnourished and they're smaller, much on average, the average Afro-Siberian red knot now has a beak that's just 4 millimeters shorter than it was in the late 1980s. That doesn't seem like very much, but it means that their beaks are not quite long enough to reach good numbers of these clams in the mudflats. And over the next 6 months or so, around 90% of them starve and die. They have to live, they have to feed on, they try feeding on little bits of seagrass and eelgrass and things like this. But there's not enough protein in that and they die. So it's a very interesting and rather sad sort of exhibition, illustration of how tiny little temperature timing changes, in a bird's breeding ground can kill it essentially halfway around the world. And of course, now these birds, there were at least 500,000 of them would typically be counted in West Africa in the 1980s. That number is now less than 100,000, and the projection is they'll probably be extinct by the year 2035. Again, this is this sort of slow and very subtle sort of play out of something that, again, we would have no idea about why the birds are declining unless a lot of scientists have spent a heck of a lot of time researching all sorts of different aspects of these birds' lives and measuring, large numbers of them and so on. Anyway, so it's, again, one of the kinds of stories that I tell in the book. The other thing that I talk about, I have a chapter about fire. I'll just briefly mention, you can read the book. Most of us read about these incredible Australian bushfires in late 2019, early 2020 that burned just enormous areas. And there was a lot of emphasis placed on, how all these forests had been burned down and how all these koalas had been killed and so on. I actually centered this chapter that I wrote about fire on a fish, a very rare fish in a river in Australia. And again, what people didn't really write about in the media is these massive fires generated just unbelievable volumes of ash, which as soon as the rains started again after the fires, washed into these rivers because there was no vegetation to hold it, on the slopes, on the land. And here I've got a picture, there's a picture I took of an Australian biologist's hand. The pool behind me used to be a 15-foot deep, absolutely clear, beautiful pool with a cobbled bottom that was perfect spawning habitat for rare fish. It is now filled with literally hundreds of tons of ash, and the water behind there is maybe 6 inches deep. And even in the intervening years when there's been a lot of rain, these pools have not emptied out. In fact, with a lot, they've been having much more than normal rain in Australia the last couple of years. It's actually just washed more sediment and crud into these streams. And so what I'm trying to do by these chapters is invite people to think a little more broadly. If we see a dramatic effect on an ecosystem like a wildfire, it's not just that area that's being affected. It's all the related ecosystems, the connected ecosystems that are being affected. And it's not just with climate breakdown, what we're seeing as a general pattern around the world is much more uneven weather than before. We're seeing deeper, longer dry periods, and then when it does rain, it tends to rain in much larger amounts in much shorter periods of time. And this kind of veering whiplash from extremes is really having pretty serious effects on a lot of ecosystems. Anyhow, I thought I'd end this off by reading just a short section from the conclusion of the book. And the concluding chapter of the book is very different from the rest of the book, in that it's more a big picture kind of thing, and it's also some of my personal reflections of what it was like, researching and writing this book. And I also talk, a little bit about the greater sort of political forces at play when we're talking about climate breakdown. And I'll just read you a quick few paragraphs from a section of the book where I talk about, again, what it was like for me writing the book, some of the personal reflections and some of the things I saw and experienced while writing the book. I'll start like this. I saw many things that I'll never forget, but a few encounters fundamentally changed me, like one beautiful blue sky and white cloud day in late February 2020, when I drove up to Australia's famed Kosciuszko National Park in the Snowy Mountains, halfway between Sydney and Melbourne. Much of it had burned 6 weeks earlier, but in the interim there'd been good rain, and I wanted to see how it was regrowing after the intense fires that had made world news for weeks on end. Many of Kosciuszko's tree species are fire adapted and should bounce back rapidly after a burn. A couple of miles into the park, I pulled my rental car over to the side of the Snowy Mountains Highway to get a closer look at a large swath of burned forest. I'm no stranger to wildland fire, and it doesn't scare me. I grew up in and live in habitats that naturally and regularly burn. But I was stunned by what I saw. A dense mass of thousands, millions of dead trees filled the landscape from horizon to horizon. The forest was the brown of dead wood and the black of charcoal. It smelled of ash and burned oil. I had never seen a place so thoroughly and extensively burned. I wandered a few hundred yards off the road into the dead trees and was surrounded by total silence. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. There were none of the fire refugia, the small unburned patches that you normally find in a post-fire landscape where many species survive blazes. I found a few small rock outcrops. They were littered with half-inch thick flakes of rock, some larger than my face, that had exploded off the boulders from the heat of the fire. Almost nothing was regrowing beneath the trees because the fire had been so hot for so long that it had vaporized the organic matter in the soil, including apparently the seed bank. There was just dry, gray-brown sand on the forest floor. There were some greenish arteries running through this ruined land. Threadbare carpets of grass were emerging along the small creeks. Threadbare carpets of grass were emerging along the small creeks, now choked with dark ash and sediment. Grass also sprouted along the road verges, immediately next to the asphalt. Its seeds had been just far enough away from the burning trees not to be killed. But these strips of green only brought more death. I have absolutely no idea how, but a few marsupials had survived the fire and, obviously starving, had made their way to the new roadside vegetation and been run down by cars. The stiff, hairy carcass of an eastern grey kangaroo lay bloating on the asphalt near me, unbothered by scavengers. I felt like I was witnessing the future in the incinerated forests of Kosciuszko, like I had passed into a place so new I hadn't fully caught up to myself yet. It felt unarguably real, yet profoundly unfair, like the feeling I've had when looking into the faces of dead people who were not ready to die, those who fought death until the last second. It was grand, epic, complete in its horizon-to-horizon endlessness and thoroughness, but not fully comprehensible and in no way beautiful. The only words I could find in response to the scene were, "We really can F this all up, all of it." So on that rather sober note, I thought I would in my presentation and invite questions and discussion. And just to note at this point, before I forget, I do have a box of books here. And if you folks would like to buy some afterwards, I'd be happy to sell them to you and sign them. I take old-fashioned paper check. Yay! I take cash and I take Venmo. I'm afraid I don't take credit cards. But yeah, let's get on to some questions.
This was wonderful. Excellent presentation. We're going to take questions first from the auditorium. Now we're going to the persons with hands. Could you tell us a little bit why you got so interested in this? What led you to such a passionate book and a wonderful book?
Is that your question or from somebody else? Sorry.
That's my question.
That's your question. Okay, great. No, well, you know, I've been, as again, I write a bit about in the final chapter of the book, I've been interested in nature and critters since before I can remember. I was catching snakes and frogs and lizards and what have you, and learning their Latin names when I was maybe 10 years old. I was one of those kids that freaked out their mother by filling their room with all kinds of critters, you know. And so I've been, you know, I've been a naturalist since, you know, as I say, before I can remember, in this sort of old-fashioned sense. Like, I'm really interested in wild creatures and finding them and learning their names and learning stuff about them. I've spent, you know, my career, well, I haven't really had a career. I've had a careen, you know, like the English say, a careen down the hill. Like I've done all sorts of things. I've been a truck driver. I've been an English teacher. I've picked apples. I've been to university a few times at various different aspects, studying various different aspects of biology and what have you. But most of my working life has been in some part of the media business, and a lot of what I've done is writing about nature and wildlife conservation and species conservation. And it's really, again, interests me, as I say, that the impact of climate breakdown is not often, in terms of its impact on wild species, is not really talked about very much. And there's very little actually that gets written about it relative to a bunch of other things. And I heard through the grapevine that a large publisher in the US was looking for a book on this topic and looking for proposals. And yeah, I jumped in there and I put this together.
Yeah, a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Actually, a comment. You said this was not, you started out by saying this is not about us, it's not about humans. It really is. I mean, everything that you said, the subtleties that you mentioned, kind of brought to my mind the things that I take for granted that are so small can be profound. So I think your book is very much about us, and I'm sure the stories in it are like the ones you've shared, and they're all wonderful. So I'm going to turn it back to Arnie, who's got other people that have questions. And we have some from online.
Oh, wait.
All right.
Hi, my name is Charles Laredo. I got and read your book after reading the wonderful review the New York Times Magazine gave at Paradise Lost. It was really very complimentary. I was very moved by the story about the lost language by the Puerto Rican parrots, as to just how subtle a change can change everything.
Yeah.
What I'm reading about now these days is more not climate weirdness, but climate despair. Many of us who are interested in this topic, and have been for many, many years, simply hit walls over and over again. Like there's nothing more that I am aware of being able to do, and yet nothing changes for the better. Yeah,
so thanks for that question. I nearly always get a variation on that question. And I think it's an important one, you know, when I do these talks. And again, I think there's, you know, I had an interaction recently. I don't know if you've seen the film Don't Look Up, the movie, which I sort of went into thinking, this is going to be more Hollywood garbage, and actually turned out to be a rather smart film, I thought, and with a great twist in the third act. And if you haven't seen it, I seriously encourage you all to actually go and watch it. I had a Don't Look Up experience just another day with a fellow working in a TV channel, and and he walks up to me and he says, "So, are we screwed?" Like this. And I say, well, again, when people ask me, like, is there any hope, or are we screwed? I always turn that question back on them. And I say, why are you asking me that question? Because are you asking me so that I can tell you, oh yeah, we're screwed. There's no hope at all, right? We're all going down in a ball of flames and there's nothing anybody can do about it, so that you can go off and sit in the corner and do nothing about it and change nothing about your life and change nothing about your community, right? Or are you asking me that question so that I can tell you, oh yeah, we're going to sort this all out. Elon Musk and his great electric cars and all of this stuff, we're going to have this all sorted out. Don't you worry about it. So you can go back and sit and change nothing about your life and change nothing about your community, And the truth is, I'm truly worried, right? I know exactly what you're talking about. People have been talking about this for ages. Loads of stuff hasn't changed. And as I say in the final chapter of the book, I'm actually more concerned than I was when I started this book. I saw some stuff, just that scene in Australia just being one of the things I saw. Never mind what the coral reefs are doing in the Caribbean, which I also saw up front, and basically they're all dying. And things like this. And we are moving into an era now, I think, where we're going to see ever increasingly fast change, rapid change. And I think the other thing that's kind of interesting about it and kind of scary is that these changes are going to be increasingly unpredictable. And I've got to know a very prominent climate scientist who works at NASA recently. I won't name the fellow, but we have regular conversations. And he said, he was always really freaked out by, they've been modeling and they've been looking at the data on climate change for years and years. And every year, the global average temperature goes up in line with the models and in line with the thing. And they understand this really well. And he said, he was always kind of an outlier in his office because he would get freaked out by this relentless year-on-year rise. But he said the other scientists that work with him weren't really that freaked out because they understood it. It was going with the models. It was doing what they predicted it to do. But he says now, in the last just few months, 2-3 months, we've seen a lot of stuff in the global climate system depart from what the models predicted and depart very rapidly. So, for example, the Antarctic in the south, the oceans in the south, have heated up radically. And they've departed massively from what the models are doing. And he said to me, and I just had this chat with him last week, he said, oh, now suddenly all the people in NASA are freaking out. For the first time, they're really freaking out because they have no idea what's going on. They've got all this data, they've got all these satellites, they've got all this stuff, and suddenly this big things in the Earth system are shifting, and they cannot tell you why. We do not know why. And so I'm just writing this book. I'm trying to put this thing out there, but I know what you're saying in that you especially every time I come to the States, people are driving these colossal motor vehicles, they're spewing huge amounts of gas around to drive one little person around in like 4 tons of metal, it's like, why? And there's all these things that are going on, and a lot of this stuff is not changing. But then the way I look at it and the way I approach it in my own life is there are actually a lot of things you can do. And especially when it comes to species conservation on the local level. So, for example, back in my place in Cape Town, we have a lot of critically endangered plant species, for example, in my city. I'm learning to grow them in my own backyard. And I'm creating a community of volunteers who are growing these species. And we are literally saving them from extinction because nobody else is doing it. We're working at local levels, at community levels to start shifting things. Because ultimately, we're going to need to shift a whole lot of things everywhere on all sorts of scales. And I understand the hopelessness. I get a lot of young people when I've done a lot of talks at universities in the last a few weeks here in the States, and there's a really strong feeling from the young people, very angry with your generation, honestly, feeling that you guys have let them down. You've left them, and there's a lot of climate despair and there's a lot of climate rage. These kids are angry and they're disappointed. with the older generation. And they're kind of feeling, well, the older folks are leaving it to us to clean up this mess. And a lot of them also don't know what to do. You know, they're struggling with the enormity of it. And it is a sense of the scale of it is very difficult. It is just difficult to comprehend. There's no easy way of saying, oh, here, I've got this one line answer. You can go up and understand this stuff. It's piece by piece. It's like, how do we eat this elephant? Well, like one bite at a time. You know, that's what we have to do. One has to work on policy. One has to work on community. You have to work on yourself. And what I often encourage people to do is figure out something that you can change to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but don't stop with you. Then figure out, how do you get your neighbors on board? How do you get the community on board? How do you build a larger community? And how do you think about resilience in your community? Because again, these shocks are coming. And I write about it in my book. We almost ran out of water in Cape Town in 2018. Our climate is totally shot. The super reliable winter rains just didn't come for 3 years. First time this has ever happened. And we were within 10 days of 4.5 million people opening a faucet and nothing coming out. Now, you can imagine the social chaos that would result from that. I was thinking of getting a gun. I hate guns, but I was literally thinking of getting a gun because I have a well and I have 10,000 liters of water in 2 large tanks on my property. That makes me a target. People were already stealing water at gunpoint before we'd even run out in our city. And again, middle-class Americans don't think about this stuff because you haven't been through these changes for generations and generations. Maybe since the American Civil War, have you not seen a sort of a disruption to society of the kind that is increasingly happening around the world? And not to be sort of catastrophist, but I encourage people to think like, what's it going to be like in your community if there's no water for a month? Or if there's no power just for 24 hours. I imagine Phoenix, Arizona with no power for 24 hours on a hot summer day. No, seriously, how many thousand people are going to die? Because that city is utterly dependent on air conditioning. Utterly dependent. You've built this very sophisticated first world society in this country, but it's incredibly fragile to these shocks. Actually,
Adam, we've got other questions we need to get to.
All right, go for it. Yes, I'm going on too long.
Yeah, my name's Mark Fire.
Yeah.
Question I have, I understand we've been talking about the disappearance of species.
Yeah.
And of course, the whole concept, the whole idea of climate and environment is really a complex issue, as you've indicated.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who, disagree with what's going on and everything. But when you start talking about species, like, why should we as human beings care about whether that bird disappears or not, other than, the general, we enjoy nature and all of that. And I understand that, but why should we care as human beings about the disappearance of that particular bird?
Well, there's 2 answers to that. Well, you could choose not to care. You can. I mean, you can say, I don't give a damn, and this stuff can all disappear, whatever. Or, you could be a little more self-interested and say, well, the whole thing about ecosystems, right, is they rely on these complex interactions and these complex components to all sort of work together in certain kinds of ways. And if you remove too many of these components, then ecosystems start collapsing. And we all rely on these systems, right? We all rely on water forests to deliver, a certain amount of water into the rivers every year. We all rely on certain huge numbers of wild pollinators to pollinate our crops and so on. And so we could lose a few species to extinction here and there and probably not notice any change in our lives. But once it reaches a critical point, you'll know about it very, very quickly. Trust me. And so I think for those reasons, you should start paying attention.
Adam, we have a counterbalancing question that you've probably answered from Karen Jacobson from Zoom.
Yeah.
What can we do to help these birds and other creatures to survive? I think that being the awareness is what you've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is not always a simple answer, right? Again, like, what can we help to do these things? And in fact, I'm writing another book right now. I've already started it, which is more focused on these solutions and these thinking around solutions. I think it is vitally important as a general thing to reduce, fossil fuel burning. It is imperative. But there are also other things you can do. Remember, climate breakdown is not the only thing that's impacting wild species, right? We're also impacting wild species through pollution, which is still going on. Yes, folks, through habitat destruction. And by lessening the impacts of those other things, you can also help wild species and stabilize systems. But it's far too complex a question, but there's no getting around the fact that we have to reduce fossil fuel burning and do it, as fast as we possibly can.
I have another question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the anger young people have.
Yeah.
Those of us that are, they're entering into many decades of the future.
Yeah.
Do you feel that anger is sufficient to be acting on it in how they vote? And do you see any difference between South Africa and America in that regard? I mean, are these kids being turned on enough to take action, or are they just angry?
Yeah, I think they're certainly in the States here now, the kids I've been interacting with, by which I'm talking about university undergraduates and so on, a lot of them are extremely smart. A lot of them are extremely active. A lot of them are really dedicated. I'm not sure that all of them have faith in the current political system. It's not like they necessarily feel like voting is going to change a whole lot, but they do feel a need to get involved in other kinds of political organization and try to make change in all sorts of other ways. Yeah, I think that's a short answer to, again, a fairly complex question. Right. It's not like they're dropping out in any way. They're very engaged with all kinds of things. But I don't know if a lot of them think that voting changes a whole lot.
I have a couple more.
There's a question in the front here. Maybe we could
take the mic to her, but that's why I'm going to use the mic. But let me cover this one from Zoom first.
Yeah.
If we from Ron Hadsel, if we were experiencing global cooling, would the changes to these living things be as pronounced? I suppose storms would be less severe, correct? I mean, that's conjecture. What would happen?
It's absolute conjecture. I mean, I think the thing that's important to realize is not necessarily the direction of the change that's important. It's the speed of the change. Because all sorts of ecosystems or species can actually evolve to adapt to change, and they have evolved to adapt to change, over the past. But if we look at the records of these mass extinctions that have happened periodically through, evolutionary time, pretty much every single one of them goes along with rapid climate change. That's the driver. That's the big thing that causes extinction, causes ecosystem collapse. And again, the direction of the change is not always super important. The ice ages, where we're standing now was probably under a mile of ice, not terribly long ago. Obviously, that sterilized the entire landscape and killed everything, right? I think what's important to recognize is that the change that we're inducing now, we are burning fossil fuels at such a rate that the best scientists who've looked at these past episodes of mass extinction say we're actually heating the atmosphere much faster than we did at any of these past episodes of mass extinction. And that should really worry us, because those past episodes, some of them resulted in, the loss of 70% of the species on Earth. But I mean, that was like heating that took place over 20,000, 100,000 years. We're heating the Earth now, much, much faster, at a much faster rate than occurred in the past there. So it's not the direction that, the fossil fuel companies like us to sort of argue about whether it's getting hotter or colder, oh yeah, in the 1970s, you said it was going to freeze and now it isn't freezing. Well, even in the 1970s, no serious scientist said it was going to freeze. That was some bullshitters on the fringe that happened to get onto some magazine covers. But nonetheless, the whole point is it's the speed of change that should concern us.
Okay. Adam, I want to read this last comment and then turn it back to the auditorium. Your book, this is from H. Rube. Your book, The End of Eden, is a very well-written description of the effects of a vacillating climate and ecosystems. It is easy and alarming to extrapolate the interactions it has on our environment. Certainly very informative. And I know we want to give people here the opportunity to purchase that book. we want to go to the last questions from the auditorium.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, I want to ask, what effect, what impact do thousands of people like me have on this change or breakdown by doing what we do every day, which is like recycling packaging? We spend a lot of time and effort doing this with the faith that this is making a contribution that's of some impact. Can you describe that impact?
Again, I think it's important to, recycle stuff rather than throw it away for various reasons, including just sort of climate reasons, which I won't go in for. I don't think you're wasting your effort, but I think it's even more important to buy less stuff in the first place, right? And I think it's even more important to, expand what you do beyond that. I think there's a tendency among a lot of folks that do one small thing in their life, and then they polish their little halos and they say, I'm a little angel and I did this one thing, and look at me. And it isn't enough. All sorts of systems have to change, and political systems have to change. We have to basically remake the way we make things. And that's a big job. Honestly, I feel we have to move to what, economists call a circular economy, where we build and design things that everything can be recycled and made into something else. And we're not doing that right now. What we're doing right now in most countries is, if you look around you, again, a lot of this stuff, all the chairs and so on, a lot of it is not easy to recycle. We're not designing it in a way that's easy to recycle in an efficient way. We're still trashing vast amounts of stuff, and we're still burning massive amounts of fossil fuels. So, I'm not saying your recycling is useless. It's certainly better than throwing that stuff in the trash for, again, all kinds of reasons, not just related to climate and pollution. But you have to think about, where do I go further? And I always say to people, just look at lawns. Lawns in America, this is another project I'm working on right now. This is the largest crop in the US by area, right? There are more acres of lawns in this country than acres of corn. It uses a higher value of pesticides than any other crop in the US, and more dangerous pesticides. If you got rid of lawns in this country, if you got rid of the obsession with having perfectly inch-long green stuff I got woken up this morning by a gas-powered leaf blower. The neighbor was polluting the air with this dumb leaf blower. If you just got rid of lawns in this country, you'd make progress. There are just millions of tons of fertilizer get used on these things that nobody even really walks on. They're just out there. The environmental impact is massive. So there are all kinds of stuff you can do that doesn't involve you burning things down and rioting in the streets, is what I'm saying. Although that might be useful at times too.
So you're pointing to political or community action.
Yeah.
So what's the most efficient community action that you know of that somebody who's in their kitchen recycling things can do beyond to expand?
Well, in this city, in this place, in this kind of neighborhood, I would say, how do you get your community shift from oil-based heat to electric heat pumps in your house? And there's all kinds of federal incentives to do that right now. It's how do you organize your folks to move from this burning fossil fuel to heat your house to electric heat pumps, which are way more efficient.
Adam, we want to just
we'll reduce just
questions and then get more.
We do want to get some books sold and signed as well. Yeah, so let's try and keep it.
All right, he said 2 more.
Alan Turover.
Yeah.
Your book leaves us in a pretty pessimistic mood, I think.
Yeah.
And I think several other books that I've written have also put me in a pessimistic mood.
Yeah.
The section talking about NASA
Yeah.
is especially concerning because you say that there are things changing that we don't understand now.
Yeah.
Do you think we have actually reached a tipping point where we can't go back? Or do you think that that tipping point is not here yet?
The short answer is I don't think there's a single tipping point. I think there are multiple tipping points within multiple systems, and I think we have tipped past some of them in some places, and we're not there yet on others. And this is there's no big on-off switch here, right? This is not a 1 or a 0 or a yes or a no. It's as the more gases that go into the atmosphere, the more likely we are to hit, nasty effects. There's no one single point at which you can say, oh, we've passed the point of no return. There are multiple points in multiple places, and it's kind of a complex issue. And again, I would encourage you just to sort of think in terms of, we just need to really try hard to slow our emissions. That's the fewer emissions go on there, the less likely we are to hit these nasty tipping points, that exist in different places and different systems along the way.
Okay.
So
I'm going to say,
then we can,
on behalf of everyone, thank you so
all
much.
right.
Great presentation.